Hey everyone, welcome to the latest installment of MSP Business School. As always, I'm Brian Doyle, your host here, and I'm really excited today. We've got a guest that you may be familiar with, a fellow podcaster out in the industry, but certainly somebody that's done a lot more than that within his career. I'd like to now welcome to the stage Todd Kane. How are you today, Todd?
I'm awesome, Brian. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me. Great to be here.
No, appreciate you joining me as well. I love to kick things off, Todd, in these episodes with folks getting to know who you are a little bit. So maybe tell folks a little bit about your journey into the great world of MSP.
Yeah, it's probably a familiar story to some. I was the neighborhood nerd that got a computer very early on, and a very vivid memory of sitting on the wet bar next to the box of an IBM PC Junior, waiting for my dad to get home so we could set that up. Kind of cut my teeth on systems administration, building boot disks for different games that I wanted to play, and then eventually started helping the neighbors with their computers, and those neighbors also had businesses. So before I recognized what was happening, I had a consulting company before I'd graduated, and had a pros and cons. Wearing a tie to school wasn't cool, but I was also building a business in high school, so that was great. I'd get called out of class to support the IT infrastructure at the school, and then kind of did my thing for a little bit. Got rolled into a very high growth consulting organization in Canada called Longview Systems, and I was very early on in the growth of that company, about employee number 30 or so, and we went on this wild rocket ship ride of hiring 20 to 30 people a week for
That's
a
amazing.
sustained period. Yeah, it was this great intersection of VMware was a brand new thing and oil was $200 a barrel at the time. And I grew up in Calgary, Canada, which is kind of like the Houston or Dallas of Canada. So lots of money just flowing through the streets for consultants. And it was a wild ride, but we had to figure out the operational side of the business. So I moved from the technical implementation side to the operation side because we needed leadership like 3 days ago kind of thing. So worked on that side of the business, and then did a couple of turnarounds for some professional services organizations in Canada, and then ended up at Fully Managed, which is pretty well recognized. Became one of the biggest MSPs in Canada, and again, kind of there through the growth phase as Chris Day was building IT Glue. We were building the Fully Managed, tripled revenue, doubled headcount, increased gross margin double digits. So it kind of reflected on all this experience, all the things that I learned in that growth and operation side, and realized there was a lot of tools in the toolbox to help apply to other IT MSP businesses. So realized I go back to my consulting roots and helping MSPs to do all the things that I learned along the way in that journey.
So you really shared some interesting things there. I definitely want to focus on the operational piece. When you start talking about hiring 20 people at a clip, you're just getting to know people's names as you're bringing new people on, right? So there's a lot that goes on with that. But before we go there, I don't want to overlook a little part of your story here. You're about the second or third person that I've talked to that's had the high school consultancy, and kudos to you, man. I mean, wearing a tie in school, I could definitely see that might be a little bit of a challenge at that age. But more importantly, it's just amazing when the more interviews I do, the more I find folks that were really kicking this off in high school and had that foresight. I was not that good. That's amazing. I mean, how did you find, and this is just a question I find interesting, how did you find yourself at that stage working with adults, right? You really, coming in as the expert to people that are much older than you. That had to be a little intimidating, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's it's important aspect. I've never really talked about this a lot, but it was really important to me that I was not viewed as young as I was. Right in high school, like it was pretty obvious. I hung out in the computer lab, and this was sort of at a point where the government was spending a lot of money in networking schools and connecting everything to hardline internet, that sort of stuff. So there was a lot of projects internally, wiring fiber inside the school and supporting the network. So there was just work available there, right? Like not like I was being paid for it. It was just experience. But that led well to going to work in some companies around downtown, some large oil and gas companies, doing internships and things like that. And I've sort of figured out very early on that if I told people how old I was, they would kind of be like, "Oh, really? Wow, okay." And then they would treat me slightly differently after
Yeah.
that. So I was very protective of how old I was for probably the first 10 years of my career, because like I was literally coming out of high school, working in these large companies. And I would even go to the extent of telling HR, like, don't celebrate my birthday, don't give anybody any indication to ask me how old I am, basically, right?
No,
So
that's great, and that I find that interesting because yeah, hiding it, I'm sure, is a big part, right? It goes both ways. As you get a little bit older, then you're hiding it the other way around, right? But
right. There's a sweet spot in the middle, right?
yeah, there is that sweet spot in the middle. But like when you think about that, and when you talk about industry, oil and gas, especially, I mean, talk about areas where there are some seriously high-powered, executives that you're going to have to interact with. You know, I, that's amazing to me that you're able to handle that young and be able to get through that because it's a wild ride, and the customer is one of the biggest challenges out there. And certainly being young, it had to be intimidating in the beginning. I know I said that earlier, but I'm wowed by that.
Yeah. No, don't get me wrong. I did some young and dumb things, absolutely too,
Oh
right?
yeah,
I learned a
that,
lot of lessons. Yeah.
well, but that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the journey. Let's
Yeah.
segue from there a little bit now into the here and now, right? You talked a little bit about doing hyperscale, really type MSP organizations. Let's get into some of the challenges that you felt you saw there. I mean, certainly hiring 20 people a month is amazing in a challenge too, right? Because
Yeah.
how do you really keep tabs on all of them when you're really talking about 240 people a year?
Yep. Well, so 20 people a week, right?
Oh, 20
Probably
people a week,
240 a
even
year.
more.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we would have these monthly or a weekly team meetings in the office, and catered lunches and stuff like that, just to attract people back from the client side to hang out there. And I would often show up and be like, "Who are all of these people?" And then like the HR person would kind of escort all of the new team members into the room, like, "Here's the new extension of your team," right? I think the biggest piece that we had to learn there was figuring out how to grow the leadership layer in a way that doesn't sort of like break the culture. And the CEO was very attuned to the type of culture that he wanted to build, and had a lot of respect for what they did. But the conscious development of that leadership team, I think, was a really important aspect. And all the tools and systems that I got exposure to as I was switching from a technical career path to an operational career path, that was really important. And I think created a lot of growth capability that otherwise would have collapsed the company under the growth pressures, right? And I think we see this even at a micro scale in businesses that average kind of good growth rate is 20% typically, annual growth rate for an MSP. And if you're cracking past 50 or even 70% growth rate, the wheels start to smoke, right? Just you get under the pressure of trying to figure out how to communicate with the staff, give them direction, give them support. And if you don't do this in a conscious way, there's this talk that I do called, building culture by default or by design.
Yep.
And your culture will be defined by what you tolerate, but it's also defined by how quickly you grow and how conscious you are about what you're trying to build. Because you're going to develop a culture, whether or not you want that culture is questionable. But if you don't put time to it, it's going to become what it will, right?
And I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that when you talk about some of the challenges when you're putting on the foot on the gas at that level, it's the law of small numbers and large numbers too. When you're growing 50 to 70% at the scale that you're talking about, it's a much different story than the MSP that's growing 50 to 70% in year two, at
Sure.
150, 100, $200,000 worth of revenue. I mean, that's some significant scale, and I can really appreciate having good managers. So these people are falling under an umbrella where there's good leadership, good stewardship, and an understanding of the culture to help them rise into their roles as you're continuing to bring people in that cadence. That's critical. How'd you
Yeah.
guys go about really finding and training your managers? Like, what were some of the tactics you took there?
Well, 90% of it was internal development, right? And I think this is a really important aspect. I often meet with MSP owners and they're getting to what I call the five guys in a room strategy,
Yeah.
where you can just sort of like talk to each other and everyone kind of knows what's going on. Once you have, close to 10 staff and above, that approach completely breaks down. And you have to start to be intentional about how you're building those that leadership. And a lot of those owners will kind of say, well, I don't think my current team is capable of this, or I tried once before and it went pretty badly, so I need to hire someone to do this. And I think that's often a mistake. It's understandable how people come to that, but I am a huge fan of promoting internally. And I think there's two things I think that lends to this being a mistake and why people get burned by this is one, they tend to look to the most senior person
Yep.
as the next leader in the organization, either because, well, Chris has been here for 8 years. I should get him up on in helping to run the business for me. But he's also the best technician. So now you're kind of cutting off a few fingers in your capability on technical delivery, and also your most senior leader is probably not the best people person in the organization. So I think in a lot of cases you're better off looking at the tier one and the tier two level for who are your future leaders. The other
Yeah.
aspect that I think goes wrong here is like they just don't get a lot of direction, right? Like a lot of the work that I do, I kind of call it, the missing playbook for being a service delivery manager, because in a lot of these cases, the technical owner has fought through this on their own, and they kind of assume that a smart person will be able to figure out all the things that they did, and they're like, "Hey, you're the service manager," pat them on the head, and then you'll do great. Let me know if you need anything, and that's the extent of their training. And the person flounders and gets frustrated, and when they feel out of their depth, they just revert back to the technical work because that's what they feel like they have some level of
Comfortable with.
control over, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, longevity doesn't equal leadership, right? When you're looking at the people
No.
that you work with, you've really got to look at who has that rounded skill set that a leader needs. And that's why, as I'm intrigued by your statement about growing out leadership to really support that, it's not easy to find folks that fit into leadership also in our industry, because there are a lot of folks that are really geared towards solo contribution, which there's nothing wrong with. We need
Yep.
those, brilliant technicians and brilliant engineers to carry things forward. But certainly there's been a trend in the industry, at least from my seat, I've seen where it's getting your standard operating procedures together. It's getting that repetitive nature. So now a leader's armed with the right tools to hopefully keep what you were talking about, that consistent growth going and keeping things away from, being a larger scale problem.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Like, I think standardization of the business in two aspects is super critical, right? And I typically talk about this from a technical stack perspective, right? For an MSP, standardization is the strongest lever that you can pull. The
Yep.
more that you standardize your client environments, the easier they are to support. But I think what you're kind of touching on is the same thing for the internal business. The more standardized the approach to the work is, the less ad hoc, the less chaotic it kind of feels, because it feels more predictable. They kind of understand, like, if these things happen, then we do this, right? And you're just kind of running that playbook, rather than like, I don't know what to focus on today. There's these six different things that I probably should spend time on, and I don't know how to prioritize. I don't necessarily know how to respond to these things. Every time that I take some action, it's kind of off the top of my head. There's no systems, there's no procedure to that, and that gets very taxing.
And take some of that, hyperscale growth that you referred to earlier, and get down to the customers that I'm sure you're working with today. One of the biggest challenges is there's also not time to be that micromanager. Not that any of us is looking for that, but if you don't have a way that you can manage at the macro level, if you don't have a way that you can make sure that people are being productive, even if you can't be there right at that moment for them, you're going to have a hard time really scaling out.
Yeah, and that's a huge aspect of this, right? Like, I honestly believe probably 50% of good management is just prioritization, like prioritization for yourself and prioritization management for your directs. And the best way to sort of like find that sweet middle, I think, is with utilizing dashboards and KPIs, right? So it fully managed, this is where I got converted to being like an absolute dashboard and data nut, is we would have TVs that hung on both sides of like a display arm coming down from the roof, and on either side you have KPIs that would represent the department below it. And that was really helpful for me because you can just literally walk around and see how people are doing. If I'd go to get a coffee, see a KPI is yellow, like, oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
I'll keep an eye on that for the next couple of hours. And then I go to get my next coffee, KPI is red. Like, okay, I'm going to go drop in, see
Time
how
to
they're
jump in.
doing, see if they need some support, right? Like if KPIs are green, leave them alone. They're doing well. Like they may just check in with them once a week and see how things are going. But I think like that's how you manage that time a little better, where you're applying your managerial energy where it's required and where it will be helpful, rather than just sort of scattershotting or smothering people that are like, look, I don't need another meeting today. I'm busy. I got stuff to do. Like, I know what I need. But certainly meeting with people on a weekly basis, I think, is incredibly helpful. There's a lot of data that goes around this, around how weekly one-on-ones are the most powerful aspect that you can have as a manager, because then you're moving at the speed of business, right? If you're having monthly one-on-ones, it's okay. You're providing some level of support for them, but then think about it. Anything goes wrong in the business and you're trying to correct it, that's now like a 3-month cycle for observation, correction, and then remediation, whether or not that issue's been closed out. Versus on a weekly schedule, like you can observe that, meet with them that week, maybe get it corrected the following week, right? So it just helps with that speed of business, right?
So, we've talked a little bit about this being kind of a technically founded industry, right? And you've got these technical founders. And another thing I've seen, and I'd like to get your views on this, is a lot of those leaders have never been leaders before. So, and the challenge then becomes when they hire those employees, what's the right way to manage? How are you working with those folks that are technical owners today and getting them to understand? You've talked about prioritization, you've talked about looking at the big picture, really ingraining those things so they're not riding their teams too hard when there's a challenge. I've seen folks go over the top over something small because in that moment it caused hardship for them and then losing trust and faith of their teams. I mean, those kind of things happening out there. Talk a little bit about your approach to really grooming managers, I guess would be the best way to say it.
Yeah, I think this is a huge aspect, right? Like, because as you say, it's not like a lot of people, go get an MBA and then start an MSP afterwards. Not that that doesn't happen. And there's certainly people that start an MSP, grow big, and then go get an MBA. But like like you said, with most of the industry, I would easily say probably 60, 70% of the industry is technical led founders, where they just go out,
Yeah.
they find some customers, they start serving them, and then they end up sort of falling their way into success, which is great. But it comes with a lot of challenges that they're not necessarily prepared for and don't have sort of the systems and training to draw upon. Then they go to promote excuse me, they go to promote a manager and sort of assume that they'll kind of go through the same methodology that they did, of just be scrappy, figure it out, right? And they don't necessarily have the same conviction around figuring these things out. And they also have the technical work that they can easily default back to. So I think a lot of like as far as the approach to fixing this is you got to have a structure, you got to have a game plan. And this is sort of 3-part methodology: is setting expectations, right? So what is required of your role? What do I want to see as outputs? Stop focusing so much on inputs, but what are we trying to produce that we can demonstrate some level of success? What do I expect from you, right? It has to be really clear. And a lot of owners will have this in their head, but never actually communicate it to the staff and certainly to the managers that they're promoting. So that's a huge aspect of it. Second piece is just providing some level of training and support, right? So you can send them to do courses like courses that I have, or have them join a peer group, or attend some industry conferences. They just have to have some exposure to how other people are doing this. Is a really important factor. And then the third is just continuous support, right? You're meeting with them on a weekly basis. You're understanding what they're challenged by. You're getting them to step up to the plate and own the things that you need to be able to delegate off to them. I think a lot of people follow this advice that I think is really bad advice at the SMB level. It works at enterprise, but it doesn't work for most of the businesses that hear this. Is hire smart people and get out of the way. I think that's a really dangerous sentiment. If you're hiring directors and VPs, there's probably some truth to that. But if you're promoting a tier 2 or a tier 3 technical person who's just worked on computers most of their life and they're pretty good at it, and to say, I'm going to go hire this person to be my service manager and just sort of let them do their thing, you're all going to be unhappy in that circumstance.
Service managers in very interesting position, and that you're hitting on there. That I've seen that be a revolving door with some places because there's really no communication about what the desired outcomes are supposed to be, and then it becomes, hey, this person really couldn't handle problems, but they didn't understand what they needed. And this is probably a good segue into what you're doing today, Todd. Right? I think we've touched on aspects of it, but you're really
Mhm.
working with those teams to kind of build a more proficiency around, operations and execution, as you said earlier. Maybe share a little bit of what you're really trying to do and bring to market today as a consultant.
Yeah, so the part that I'm really passionate about is the operations of the business. We tend to focus a lot on revenue growth and revenue enablement, which is the blood of the business. It's important, but I like to focus much less on the top line, and I like to focus on the bottom line because running a $10 million MSP that is a lot of hard work and drains your life from you versus running a $5 million MSP that generates the exact amount of same amount of profit for less stress is a way better circumstance to be in as far as I'm
Yep.
concerned. So building a sustainable business that doesn't cripple you as a business owner, I think is really important, and that's what I like to focus on is increase stress or excuse me, decrease stress and increased revenue, right? So I think that's an important aspect, and that a lot of that is just getting operations right, right? So if you're a smaller owner and you don't have a middle management yet, like getting those systems in place so that you can delegate that hat off to that person as you're ready to, I think becomes really important. And then once you have a service manager or someone or a team lead that you're trying to train into that role, having some systems and some training that they can rely on, right? So I've one of my flagship courses is Service Manager Boot Camp, right? So like, what are all the basics that you need to understand to be an effective manager in an MSP? What do I do all day? What KPIs should I use? How do I manage my team? How do I hire and fire people? Right? These are the basic components of frontline leadership that you as an owner either don't know or don't have a lot of the time to spend training that person into, and this becomes really invaluable for people. So that's a lot of what I focus on is the strategic and tactical execution around that business and building organizational muscle that relies on these best practices and systems from the industry that are not they're not actually that difficult. Find a lot of people can have pretty dramatic shifts in their business after 2 to 3 months of just focusing on some of these basic components of good operational efficiency.
Yep. And you're hitting upon some of the bigger challenges that you run out there. You were spot on with the fact that there's a lot of focus on revenue growth, but you do reach a certain size in your, as you mature your MSP, where it's, should we grow or should we fire, right? And really start, if you don't have good operational metrics, how do you know that somebody's really costing you more than maybe what you're making to deliver that service? Or maybe you can improve your profit margin from 30% to 50%, which is something that you would like to do on your exit and be able to demonstrate by getting rid of this tranche of customers that's really not bringing in enough revenue to even be concerning at that
Yeah.
stage. So
Yeah, I agree. Like I often say, like a good sort of measure of growth and maturity for an MSP is the first time you fire a client and having the confidence of like, look, I love your revenue, or maybe I don't love your revenue, but like we can't work together going forward because there's just a values mismatch, and this is not a good partnership. It takes a level of confidence to be able to fire a client, but I think it's really demonstrates your capability of what you're trying to build. Again, being intentional about the culture of the organization that you're building and not accepting those clients that don't align with what your organization could and should be.
So, I'll poke a little fun at myself at this point and say, that was a mistake I made as a younger manager. We had reached a point where the customer was literally looking at me going, maybe we're not the right customer for you anymore. Maybe we're too small for your infrastructure. And, you want to be gracious to people who are with you day one, especially if they were nice, right? This wasn't a
Sure.
noisy, difficult customer, but the truth was they were killing us all around. They were killing us with small tickets that they just were not grasping, like the same calls over and over and over. And, the revenue was not going to generate, improve. And certainly, they weren't feeling that same level of touch they did when they were employing or customer number three. And but it was hard to let go of that. And it's good to have somebody like you helping folks understand when it's time to do that.
Yeah, as I often say, never be afraid to go up market, right? Raise your prices. If you've not raised your prices in the last 2 years, you're discounting by at least 10 to 15% due to inflation. So be more confident about what you should be charging for your services. I guarantee you, there's a market for it.
So we're getting near the end of our time today, Todd. I want to make sure that you've got time to share anything else you'd like to cover before we break today. And then, of course, I'll share with everybody where they can find you.
I think we've covered a lot of it, to be honest, Brian. I think it's a good conversation. Just I think being really realistic about getting help for growth, right? Like there, I don't think it speaks to anyone's failing if you need some support from a peer group, from a coach. Michael Jordan had a coach.
Yeah.
Tiger Woods had a coach, right? Like the best in the world need some support and some outside perspective. And I think as you grow your business, you're inside the bottle and cannot read the label. And having some external perspective of someone that can tell you these are the things that are going on in the industry that I think could really help you and apply. What are the roadblocks? What are the things that are stuck? And a lot of this is just head trash. A lot of owners and managers, they just need someone to talk to sort through what they're thinking and the things that they've run into in impediments. And if we can give them tools to help them to get past those circumstances and get to the next level, that's huge. So that's not. I think it's a demonstration of strength that you're willing to get support from someone and look for some external support in order to get where you want to go in the next stage of your growth. Whether that's just so it's a little more comfortable to run your business, or so that you're prepped for a sale, right? And making sure that you're optimizing the most dollars that you can get for all your hard work, right?
Yeah. So, listener, if you want to get to know a little bit more about Todd and his business, I just put up the URL for those that are watching YouTube. It's a business.com for those of you that are listening audibly, and we'll post this into the show
IT
notes as
is a business,
well.
not yeah, not
Or
it's a
IT
business.
is a
IT
business.
is a business. Yeah, yeah.
I should do better than that. That's
No,
on
no,
me
that's fair.
there.
That a lot of people make that mistake with the URL. So yeah,
No, no, that should have been on me. I'll poke fun at myself again, like I did earlier. Also, I've put up Todd's LinkedIn again. If you're listening audibly, you'll be able to get this in the show notes. But connect with him. That's obviously a great way for all of us to communicate as well. But if you're really struggling with that operational journey, if you're having that challenge of scaling your business, not from a sales perspective, but not knowing if you're running efficiently, it sounds like Todd has a lot of great opportunities and courses where he can potentially help you get Andy's got the pedigree to get the trainer running right.
yeah. Awesome.
All right.
Appreciate it, Brian.
All right. Well, Todd, thank you so much for joining me today. Really excited to have you on here, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Sounds good.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take care.